to begin by inviting Mr. T.V. Narendran, past President CII and CEO and MD Tata Steel India, to give his welcome remarks.
Thanks, Renuka, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to introduce the fellow panelists who are here and make a few remarks, and then we get into the panel discussion. We have Mr. Vineet Mittal, the chairman of Avada Group. We have Mr. Rajiv Ranjan Mishra, the managing director of Aprava Energy. Mr. Thomas Kerr, who's the lead climate specialist, South Asia World Bank Group. Ms. Devya Sharma, who's the India executive director of the Climate Group. And Mr. Ashish Setia, who's the global head of commodities, energy and environmental markets for Bloomberg NEF. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you. I'm delighted to be here to welcome you to this session on enhancing global cooperation in accelerating net zero transitions. It's indeed a privilege to have with me on the dais a very distinguished panel of speakers that I introduced just now, and I extend them a very warm welcome to all of them. I note that our panel today is representatives from various stakeholder groups, from industry to financial institutions to research organizations, all in the climate change space. And this is quite apt given that the focus of the session is on enhancing global cooperation, and that is something which can only be achieved by all the relevant global stakeholders coming together to look for actionable solutions to address the challenges of achieving net zero emissions. The world is poised to confront unprecedented challenges in the form of climate change, and it is in this context that the transition to a net zero future requires immediate action. I'm happy to observe that there is a growing momentum towards new and emerging clean energy technologies, which is indicated by strengthened international and national climate ambitions. However, to achieve an ideal net zero future, improved access to capital, holistic and synergistic regulatory frameworks, and enhanced international cooperation will be critical going forward. This transition to net zero will also require coordinated efforts spanning all stakeholders, including governments, the private sector, and civil society. It will be essential to formulate policies and regulations that support this transition, including carbon pricing, regulation of methane emissions, and the adoption of circular economy principles. In parallel, it is vital to prioritize investments in renewable energy, building a more flexible and resilient energy system, and accelerating innovation in carbon capture and storage technologies. All such efforts need to be powered through international collaborations and depth coordination to ensure that the successful transition to a net zero future is done with the minimum disruption. I would like to stress that the path to a net zero future is not without its challenges. One of the biggest obstacles would be the divergences observed in the sphere of global cooperation and collaboration and coordination. Despite the urgency of the climate crisis, the world has yet to see a coordinated global response that matches the scale and speed of the challenge. Therefore, it's essential to increase targeted cooperation in areas such as energy efficiency, carbon capture and storage, and the development of green hydrogen. Innovation and adoption of new approaches can also play a crucial role in accelerating the pathway to net zero. For instance, the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning can help optimize the operation of renewable energy sources and grid systems, leading to increased efficiency and lower costs. Similarly, the development of green aviation fuels such as sustainable biofuels or hydrogen has the potential to significantly reduce the carbon footprint of the aviation industry. In conclusion, it is my firm belief that the transition to a net zero future is a challenging yet achievable goal. It will require concerted efforts and cooperation from all stakeholders, including governments, the private sector and civil society, as I mentioned earlier. Policies, investments in international collaboration and coordination will be essential to ensure a successful transition. And the emergence of new and innovative approaches to the net zero transition also gives me hope that a successful transition is within reach. In this context, it will also be crucial to better define the role of multilateral bodies, industry associations, and other stakeholders in promoting the development and adoption of best global practices. As a co-chair of the B20 Task Force on Energy, Climate Change, and Resource Efficiency, I look forward to a productive and insightful discussion that would help identify key priority action areas and solutions on how to enhance global cooperation towards net zero transitions. We'll now get into the discussions, and I will invite my panelists to address some of the questions that we have, and of course, if there's time, to address questions that you have. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start with some of the questions that I have. And the first question is, to achieve a net zero future, it's essential to prioritize investments in renewable energy. And what specific policies and investments can be made to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy technologies in developing countries? And how can developed countries support these efforts through international cooperation? So I'll start with Thomas for his thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, and it's great to be back here with CII for this session. I was reflecting as you were saying, the multi-stakeholder panel. I think I've sat in the shoes of many different organizations, whether it's government, private, civil society, and others, and I think this is absolutely critical for this discussion to have. And so in terms of renewables, I look back at my career working on clean energy, and we look at let's just step back for a second, and everybody was focused like a laser on reducing the cost of delivered energy. So solar, PV, onshore wind, and now many other technologies like offshore wind, hydro, are really getting to the point where they are the lowest cost delivered energy. So that's a great accomplishment, I think. But then we have to then look at the missing piece of the puzzle. And I looked at, when I was flying here from Washington, I was looking at an assessment of the installed renewable capacity versus the renewable energy potential. And clearly in the largest emerging economies has the most potential, but the most capacity is in Europe, North America, and Japan. So why is that? If we reduce the cost of technology, and if this is actually the fact that these clean energy technologies are more competitive than their fossil fuel counterparts, why are we still seeing that? And it really comes down to higher cost of capital. So in terms of higher cost of capital, there are sort of two things that we've been trying to focus on to tackle that problem, because that's really the final, sort of camel straw that breaks the back, and we can really get it into market. So first is, the old saying, if you build it, they will come. It's policy. It's the right policy design. So we're sitting here in India. India actually is a terrific example of how you can build the policy and create a market. So I used to work at the International Energy Agency about 12 years ago. We were doing a lot of analysis around solar and how we scale it up. And at that time, India was really not on our sort of top 10 or 20 lists of countries. You fast forward to today, and India is the 4th or 5th largest solar market globally. In about a decade, they did this. And they did this through a series of targeted policies, so the solar mission, other renewable energy missions. You had national sort of agencies like IREDA, you had, but then you also had, very importantly, the state action. So it was not just national, it was state action. You had state obligations to purchase. You had a coal cess to kind of balance the fossil price. And then you saw a mix of public finance, public policy, and then the private sector came. And I think the numbers are like about $130 billion now have been invested in renewable energy in the past, since 2004 in India, because the government took that approach. Now, sure, there are other things to continue to do for the market. We have to work on grid stabilization for intermittent resources and battery storage, but they've really done a great job. And actually, we're just finishing a big report on decarbonization policy that I'm authoring, and we're featuring India as a case study for solar. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing, though, is even if you do build it, sometimes they won't come because there still are perceptions of risk by the investors. So whether it's political risk, currency exchange, other risks around off-takers, these still will exist in a lot of contexts. And so there we are really targeting a lot. You'll hear a lot about the terms blended finance or concessional finance. So this is a term where you use very strategically public funds. So we obviously do this at the World Bank or development finance, but a national or state government can also capitalize a blended finance fund. And that is used in a very targeted way to leverage private capital. So it can be used for technical assistance to build the project pipeline. It can be used for, to mitigate some of these risks I talked about, whether it's off-taker risk or others, currency exchange, or it can be used to aggregate some of these smaller projects that don't really seem attractive. The ticket size isn't big enough, so you attract the private sector. So in sum, I think the two things that we're really focusing on is the policy environment, but you can't just do that. You also have to work at how can you bring in private sector finance by mitigating those final risks. Then you can bring down the cost of capital, and I think we'll really see a lot more in renewables, especially in emerging markets.
Thanks, Thomas. So Rajiv, finance and policies. Anything else, or even on this, would you like to add to what Thomas said?
Yeah, no, I think, thanks very much. The points made by Tom are spot on, and particularly if we look at the tremendous change made in India. One of the things I would like to highlight is something that we should take note of. The design of non-discriminatory, open, competitive markets has done more to attract renewable energy investments in India than every state policy before that. I think since we also have a B20 meeting jointly around this time, it is important for many of the B20 countries to remember that. It's more about, in my opinion, at least once an economy reaches a certain stage, about taking out risk than just cost. Designing such policies result in a lot of the risks and uncertainties being taken away, and that has been a key factor. I don't have too much to add, but I thought I would just add on to what the points Thomas made on importance of attracting investments in the sector.
Thanks. Divya, how do you see it from the climate group perspective? How do you see these transitions, and the investments that are happening? Are they good enough, or do you have any thoughts that you want to share?
Yeah, thank you for that. I would like to focus particularly on the policy side of it. So we work with several large businesses, and they work with us around some of our campaigns that ask them to transition 100% all their processes across their business sectors to renewable electricity, for example. There are other campaigns that look at electric vehicles and energy productivity, but we are talking about renewable electricity, and so I'll keep it to that. And some of the policy asks, those are global policy asks that are emerging from what these businesses are asking government to do, revolve around some of the factors that Rajiv just spoke about. And the top 5 of them, I would like to bring to your notice, one of which is create a level playing field between the renewable electricity so that they can compete fairly with fossil fuel electricity providers, which is somehow missing at the moment. And then there's another one around removing regulatory barriers and creating several stable frameworks to facilitate the uptake of corporate renewable electricity sourcing. The third one is around creating market structures, because unless we have stable and useful market structures that allow for direct trade between corporate buyers of renewable electricity and renewable electricity suppliers, it won't be really possible to scale up what businesses look at in terms of transitioning to renewable electricity. The fourth one is to work with utilities. It's very important to work with electricity suppliers to provide options for corporate renewable electricity sourcing. And there are many options, we know, but we have to see how there are enabling mechanisms that are brought forth to be working very closely with some of these utilities. And the last one is to promote direct investments in on-site and off-site renewable electricity projects. These are some of the asks that have emerged from our business and corporates that work with us. And we really think that some of these, if are driven through policies, will really help in the transition and the scale and the speed of transition that we are looking at.
Thanks, Divya. Ashish, you've been looking at global markets, and Divya also talked about market structures and also the way you buy and sell renewable energy. What are your thoughts on that? And at an overall level, what more do we need to do to help this transition move faster?
Mr. Narendran, I think we talked a lot in detail about specific issues across the panelists. I wanted to take a step back and first talk about where we are in the energy transition, what does the data show us, and where we need to be. So here's some data for all of us to digest. Last year, a record 400 gigawatt of renewable electricity was installed globally. This number, in my team's estimate, is going to go up to a staggering 600 gigawatt by end of 2025. Right? So we are on the right track. We also had more than $1 trillion of investment in a single year last year in the energy transition. So that's another bit of positive news. But here's the scale of challenge. Even after all the progress we have made on installing renewable energy capacity around the world, in 2021, less than 30% of electricity globally generated was from renewables. The market share for coal and gas power generation is still 60%. Market share for nuclear is around 10%. So talking about capacity is one thing, talking about actual generation is another beast in itself. Generally, most policymakers now agree around the world that one of the easiest things to do in pathway to net zero is to decarbonize the power system, but we are only at 30%, right? And we have to scale this $1 trillion a year number to almost $4 trillion a year if we have to get anywhere close to a pathway to net zero. So I think that's just kind of first thing to mention. The second thing is we have not even started talking about decarbonizing other sectors of the economy. How do you decarbonize transport? How do you decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors like steel, aluminum, cement, petrochemicals? Even there, electricity has a very, very critical role to play, in our opinion, right? So decarbonize the power sector. First thing, scale has to be 3 to 4 times for renewables. But beyond that, renewable also need to help to decarbonize transport sector via electric vehicles or decarbonize steel and petrochemicals and other things. So the challenge is quite staggering in my opinion.
Thanks, Ashish. So I'll come to Vineet. So Vineet, are we underestimating the cost and complexity of this transition?
So I would like to, am I audible? Yeah. So I would like to do two things. One, look it from the global context, that how developed nations can encourage and motivate more for developing nation to become role model for energy transition. And the challenge for every developing nation, including ours, is that we still have people to pull out from poverty, and energy is the greatest enabler, and I call it generally inversely proportional to poverty. So from whatever source we can get energy, India would continue to first prioritize energy access and energy security more than the source of energy. But India has taken a tremendous step there in greening its grid and greening its hard-to-abate sector by launching green hydrogen and its variant policy. So India is doing outstanding work there. But one of the challenge which we face is, like my co-panelists brought out about, is the cost of funding. That by going green, we are being penalized because our cost of funding is higher. And second challenge is that developing nations are not creating a level playing field, developed nations. So if you look at US has announced 400 billion plus IRA, it is expected that Europe will announce similar IRA today. If developed nations are going to provide so much of capital subsidy for energy transition, it's good. It should be used. It should be used for their own uses than using it for the export market and creating a lopsided trade market. Like if people expect developing nations to generate that kind of subsidy to the sector, none of the developing nations would be able to support that kind of capital subsidy. So if world has to really transition towards net zero, like Aditya was saying that you need $1 trillion and $4 trillion, really, India needs $160 billion a year, even now. And India is able to generate that capital. But what is needed when we are going to transition into hard-to-abate sector? India needs hand-holding, and so is the other developing nation. So Europe has come out with a good policy of very specific target of 20 million ton hydrogen by 2030, which is loosely 110 million ton of ammonia, 50% of it to come from export market. So first, we should actually have a global definition what is considered green hydrogen. So if you look at US, the proposed definition is 1 year banking of energy is allowed, which is very prudent in terms of that we should use what is the technology available today and what is the roadmap for newer technology, and how do we make green hydrogen and its variant coming from the green sources, but we should not play with technology and try to favor one technology over other. So this is the same debate happening in Europe. What Europe has done is, after a lot of representation from developing nations, they have bought a green ammonia and green hydrogen definition, where they are saying banking is allowed. Till 2030, you can bank on a monthly basis, and then you have to bring it back to hourly matching of electron and molecule, which is again sheer politics. It's not something which is encouraging a global standard definition of green hydrogen and its variant, and neither it's creating a level playing field. And then on top of that, developed nations are signing contracts with developed nations. So they'll sign with Australia to supply them the contract. So where is the role for developing nations? You go to COPs, you go to World Economic Forum, all of these panels talk about developing nations have an important role to play. But what is rest of the world doing to motivate them and encourage them? There is Article 6 in COP 26, which actually even very clearly says that greening of planet can be attributed to the developed nation if they provide financial grants or some kind of benefits to the developing nation. Why is world not thinking about that Europe has an ambitious plan, take 50% of their export target from developing nations and make a standard definition which is technologically most suitable, which encourages more adoption of green hydrogen in hard to abate sector and creates a very vibrant green economy across the world, where only Europe and US is not the winner, but the world at large is winner, because everyone needs to go green. There is no two debates about it. But I think the level playing field needs to be created around cost of funding, as well as around the definition what is treated for green. And third is around not creating artificial trade barriers by providing trillions of dollars of subsidy to their local businesses and making them export. India can never compete. So what is in it for India to transition to green? They would do what they can do responsibly. So I think world has to become practical. You can't keep imposing unnecessary targets without creating the enabling environment.
Thanks, Vineet. I think, Thomas, I'm going to come to you because a lot of points have been raised, and I think at a very fundamental level, this century is going to see 4 billion people added to the world population, and 1 billion is in Asia, 3 in Africa. And as Vineet said, for a lot of people, it's about making sure that you have power available to them, and then you, of course, ideally have green power available. So this global north versus global south is a conversation that's going to keep coming at us in different forums, right? There's no easy solution. There were commitments made about money flows from the developed countries to developing countries. Developing countries, as Vineet said, are also struggling with providing basic services and the need to transition. So what is the kind of role that World Bank can play in this very complex journey that we need to undertake?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it's at the core of the World Bank's operation now, and there's been a lot of attention. In fact, we have our spring meetings coming up next month, and we're talking about something we're calling the Evolution Roadmap, about how you evolve development finance to basically be able to handle a multi-crisis world and still deliver on poverty reduction and things like that. So one thing I'll talk about that I think is an attempt that we have made over the past 2 years to really double down on this sort of tension between development and climate change. We've been doing these global set of reports. Every single one of our client countries will undertake one of these reports in the next sort of in a rolling basis over the next few years. And so I'm doing one in India right now. We've done one Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal in this region, but China, Indonesia, Brazil has all been doing these. They're called the Country Climate and Development Report. And essentially what that does is it flips the usual narrative where we're coming at you with, you have to do this because of climate change. And it's actually starting with the country's development pathway, their ambitions to achieve middle income status, their job creation, the sector growth that they're looking at. And then we have a much better analysis of let's overlay the climate change impacts that are happening today that are maybe going to frustrate that vision of your future. And then we also have models that are able to forecast those impacts in the future, things on heat and labor productivity and and the availability of water for hydro and things like that. So it's a very detailed look, and it shows basically how the imperative for action on climate change. And then for the larger emitting countries as well, we look at their emissions profile today and how that's expected to evolve. And then we overlay their sort of NDCs, the commitments they've made as a national level. And we then funnel through that process, and a couple of red flags will pop up in terms of things they're missing, or sometimes also opportunities that are popping up that they could invest in the global economy. So one great example I thought was the one in Argentina was looking at, they want to invest in an unconventional oil and gas field there. And we did some analysis around stranded asset and how, if you assume the way that the world is going to head in net zero and the price on carbon that will be part of that, why that's not a great investment. And then at the same time, we looked at their lithium reserves, and they had not looked at the lithium in terms of growth and potential for that to drive their economy in the future. And we did some analysis around that. So here in India, we'd love to hear, we're in the middle of this discussion. I think a lot of you are very active in the market. What are sort of the key opportunities or barriers that are facing, and how do we present that in a way that we can get into the point I was talking about earlier, that each of these sort of, there's a spectrum of low carbon technologies, right? There's, from the solar, which is cost competitive today, but then may have some barriers or policies, to the green hydrogen, which isn't cost competitive, but could use a boost in terms of public investment and policy frameworks. And so we're trying to kind of crowdsource with industry, with financiers and others, what are the key actions that the country has to take to straddle that development and climate sort of future and really deliver on growth and achieve the goals that they have for their economy. So that's one contribution we're making to this discussion. But I think the other point is just to really have to invest, the imperative of investing in resilience. While we make this transition, the next decade or so, we're going to see more disasters. We're going to see more coastal flooding. And so also showing up resilience is another key part of that.
Thanks, Thomas. Rajiv, Vineet also talked about level playing field. There's also this conversation around carbon pricing, carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no. Just to pick up on Vineet's point, Narendran, I think he raises a few important points. If we look around the world, the $100 billion a year, which was supposed to flow, which was maybe 7-8 years back, and obviously it was deemed to be too much, nothing much materialized out of it. And I read some data, and I'm not a macroeconomist, so I might be off a little bit, but I suspect not by too much. Just during the pandemic, the major central banks of the world printed $8 trillion. $8 trillion. That is, by simple arithmetic, I think 80 years of $100 billion each. So I think if we look around the world, the simple fact is that one finds, and I know you see it more directly in Tata Steel, there is no appetite that at least one finds in Europe for any sort of fund transfer to developing countries, at least developing lower middle income developing countries. That is one thing. On the other hand, to look at Vineet's point slightly differently, if we look at ourselves in India, climate change, the devastations caused by extreme weathers is not a 2050 challenge for us or 2070 challenge for us. It is here and now today. We have seen the unusually warm weathers this winter. We have seen incredible floods in our neighborhood. So whilst there is this politics and interplay of various forces in the world, we cannot forget that we owe it to ourselves, our current and next generation, to do all we can about it. And the third point I wanted to highlight on that is, without getting into politics of this, the sort of, I don't know whether the term used is deglobalization or redivision of the world or the new Cold War or what have you. The trend away from globalization is a major threat as well. If we look at new technologies, 100 to 80% of processing of key materials which go into, for instance, batteries, are in one country. Production of 60 or 80% are in another African country. Thomas raised the issue about Argentina. And this move in the world towards camps, of which the IRA and the European response are two recent examples. I don't know why by the way, it's called the IRA. It's just a climate change bill. What it has about inflation, I don't know. But then, as I said, I'm not a macroeconomist. And those things are going to create additional challenges. Now, in the backdrop of that, how do we respond to it? I think one can always get overwhelmed by challenges. The important thing is that each market, each country has to look at what it can do. I think there is plenty we can do. You know, about 8 years back, through another body, we had the opportunity to visit the transmission, the grid operator of the erstwhile Eastern Germany, you know, headquartered in Berlin. It's actually called 50 hertz because their frequency is always 50 hertz. And the CEO said that, well, I'm about 55% renewables. Once I reach 60%, I really need to worry about how do I maintain the stability of the grid. We are what, 12% or 13%, and we already are facing a problem. So there are lots of non-direct financial information flows and knowledge flows which can happen before the world gets into the issue of global carbon tax or minimum carbon tax, which I think is excellent. Unfortunately, in the real world, I see very little appetite for it. So I'm sorry to be negative on that.
Thanks, Rajiv. Divya, so we heard about the challenges, global north versus global south, developing, developed, etc. While at the same time, there have been some good examples of which India has also been part of, the International Solar Alliance, and even the Center for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, etc. So these are areas where there's been global cooperation. And as somebody who's looking at it from a different perspective, how do you see the opportunities to work together? And are there any other good stories that come to your mind?
Yeah, sure. I think, yes, you've mentioned some of the greatest initiatives that Indian government has taken forward. And these are all, I would say, vehicles of change. And no doubt the world is looking at us. And there are definitely very important examples in our work in Climate Group. We are seeing a lot of this change that is happening through our campaigns. We work with 500 global companies and in 175 markets. And our campaigns, as I said, revolve around 100% transition to renewable electricity, to electric vehicles, energy productivity. Two of our campaigns are specifically for the hard to abate sector, for example, Steel Zero campaign, which is around green private procurement of low carbon steel. And the other one that is a global program, again, all of these is Concrete Zero. We see that these businesses are coming forward, working with us, taking these ambitious targets, also every year announcing their impacts and they are announcing their progress. So we hold them accountable for the change that they are making, for the targets that they have taken. And the process is around the business. The changes that they are making are around all of their processes. So I think that's really encouraging. Definitely, there's a lot of work to be done because all these large businesses that we work with have a role and opportunity as well as a responsibility to also influence their value chains. And look at the SMEs. And there is still time for that to happen. And there is a lot of resources and businesses are already asking they are signaling the government to give that kind of energy structures for them to be able to do so, to influence the value chains that they work with. Because unless that entire ecosystem is changed, we will not actually look at the speedy results that we want to see. So I think there's hope and there's change that is happening, but there is definitely acceleration that needs to happen.
Thanks, Divya. Ashish, you've been watching global markets. So are there going to be inflationary pressures because of this transition? Because a whole lot of industries have to transition. There's a lot of money to be spent. There's a lot of commodities which are not going to be available, to support this transition. There are a lot of commodities where there's going to be underinvestments in anticipation of this transition. So how do you see all this playing out, and will it impact the journey that we plan to take?
Interesting set of questions. Let me first talk about capital required very, very briefly before I talk about how expensive this is going to be. In our estimation, getting to net zero globally requires around $194 trillion of capital spend between now and 2050. So Rajiv is the only other person who talked about trillions of dollars, right? So I wanted to up the scale a bit. So that's the amount of capital you need. Now, in certain places, the technology costs are behaving in a fashion where using new technology is already cheaper than using traditional stuff, right? So for example, and Vineet and Raju talked about this, renewable energy, Thomas talked about it. In our estimate, 3/4 of the global population now lives in countries where building and generating electrons from a renewable power project is cheaper than building a conventional thermal power project and generating electricity out of that. So that's kind of partly the good news. In fact, in some countries now, building a new solar wind power project and delivering electrons via that project is less expensive than running, not building, running an existing thermal power project. We call it tipping point 2 in our modeling, right? So we, in certain places, technology is there. It needs to be scaled up. It needs to be scaled up 4 to 5 times, as I said earlier. A system which has 4 to 5 times of this kind of a capacity looks like a completely different system than what we're used to seeing. This is not going to be a system which was built around thermal power generation. You're adding a bunch of renewable on top of it. This is going to be a system which is built as renewable as a foundation, and you add a bunch of other things around it, right? To complete that point very briefly, I'll also say we started using a phrase internally, which I really like. And Raji would appreciate this because we have both backgrounds in power sector. There's no transition without transmission. What I mean by that is, in our estimation, you can build all the renewable energy supply projects around the world that you want, as much as you like. But the transmission system has to be built along with it. And you need to build almost 152 million circuit kilometer of transmission system. To give you an idea of how large this is the distance between Earth and Sun. That's the amount of transmission power capacity you need to build around the world, right? So again, I keep going back to this point of the scale of challenge, because I think we are getting a little bit complacent looking at the cost of renewable energy and those kind of things and saying, oh yeah, we'll get there easily. It's not going to be easy. To your point, Mr. Narendran, this is also going to be expensive. In areas outside the power sector where we know the technology solutions, we will need to scale up supply chains quite significantly. Taking electric vehicles as a brief example, obviously you need significant amount of cobalt, lithium, manganese. Copper is an interesting element we have looked at in a lot of detail. We need to really kind of scale up copper supply around the world. Lithium, the world needs 17.5 times more lithium in 2050 than it consumes today, right? So again, these numbers are going to be staggering. There will be a significant disruption in the supply chain. I think what we're going to see is some of these supply chains, whether it is lithium-ion batteries or electric vehicles or renewable power equipment, starting to behave like other commodities markets as they behave today. In certain years or certain group of years, you will have supply which is catching up to demand, and there's balance in the market and prices are stable. But in many other number of years, you will have supply lagging because demand is just skyrocketing and prices kind of go haywire, right? So we'll have to adapt ourselves as a society and as businesses to adapt to these commodity price cycles as well.
Thanks, Ashish. I think.
Narendra, can I just add?
Yeah,
It's a very important point.
Yeah.
The electricity sector is one where we make investments for 25 or 40 years. Only then you recover. And inherent understanding or expectation amongst the consumers has been that I should know the price for 25 years in advance. The moment we move away from thermal fuels, including actually gas, which Europe loves and sees as a bridge to a completely green future. The fact is, we have had a gas-fired power plant in India for 25 years. You do not know next month's prices. There is absolutely zero acceptance amongst the consumers for electricity bill changing by 40% or 50% on a month-to-month basis. That is an important challenge that we face. The change in mindset, and that is where the governments and policymakers and all of us have to play our part, that we have to understand that there will be far more volatility, not necessarily an increase always, but a far more volatility in this important price, and they will start behaving more like commodities than they historically have. I do not believe we have talked enough about that in any country, and there is not enough acceptance of that. That is another big challenge.
Sure. So I have a follow-up question then, because one of the complexities of this transition, for over 150 years, the world has build supply chains to move fossil fuels, right? Coal, oil, gas itself is relatively new, and we know that if you only have pipelines and not LNG terminals, what happens, right? So I think when you move to new supply chains, and if you think that electricity will flow easily across borders, it doesn't flow easily across countries, right? So the regulatory environment needs to be different, the volatility that you talked about, and we've not even started the transition for process industries, right? So I think that to me is a big concern because I'm from a process industry. The easy part is what we're doing, solar panels and, get some green electricity to electrify as much of the economy as possible. But these transitions, and I think that's the subject of today's discussion, cannot be done by countries by themselves in isolation, right? It has to be done globally and through some cooperation. So as somebody who's been in this space for a while, so where do you think we need to work more at?
Yeah, no, as I mentioned in response to an earlier question, the move away from the global compact, the Washington consensus, whatever it may be called, is a big threat, because the fact is that no country is an island, literally and metaphorically, in this space. Even if you look at let's say a simple solar panel which is installed, we have nearly 50 gigawatts of it in India. We know it is not, all the materials are not local. It has come from all over the place. And similarly, if you look at the transmission system. So that is a big threat. Now, how do we get over it? My own view is in the high tables of the world, and indeed by institutions, the World Bank, depoliticization of some of this and trying to, if you like, there are defense challenges, there are issues about security and threat, and we have seen a terrible war in Europe. But in a sense, talking about the climate change as an existential crisis separately from everything else, and therefore at least having, if you like, a safe space where the world agrees to cooperate, irrespective of the other geopolitical tensions, is absolutely key. Without that, it'll be impossible. And I think some of the other things that can be done is starting to share expertise in areas which do not directly involve funds transfer, as I said, whether that be business models, market models. The ISA, which you mentioned earlier in a question, has done a fair bit of work on this, on standardizing the bid documents for these island nations, which they do not have big enough markets like Indonesia or India, where they can attract a lot of investment and a lot of bidders. So those are the kind of things, and grid management. I mean, we haven't even started, even in India, about how much cost is being hidden at the moment for building the grid to carry the green electrons. And finally, I would say, because the scale of the problem is so big, one has to start at what one can do here and now, is simple demand side measures. Time of the day tariff. What that can do as the amount of solar increases in the grid is immeasurable, and go a long way towards reducing the entire system costs than simply adding one panel after another, all of which will start generating at 9 a.m. and stop generating at 5 p.m. We are very close to the equator. It's pretty much 12 months a year, and that will create a lot of havoc.
Thanks, Rajiv. Vineet, some of these solutions are known, needs to be scaled up. Some of the solutions are still being developed. And so my question is a little bit more on technology and innovation, and what have you seen that also adds to the hope that you have that we'll do this transition as we need to do it?
So I think one of the hype which I always hear about is the cost of technology, and that in energy transition, electrolyzer cost is the stumbling block, and solutions for transporting hydrogen or transporting green fuels. So my sense is like what Rajiv was saying before, and what World Bank aspires to do is that why are we not looking at that there are many institutions which have built these technology and they need scaling up. Why can't world look at that it is not transfer of money from developed nation to developing nation? So if Fraunhofer has a heterojunction and electrolyzer technology, why can't we open source it and let anyone and every country which wants to they build on top of that and bring down the cost of electrolyzer to $100,000, where the cost of gray or green ammonia doesn't matter. It's almost the same. So technology can be a great enabler. The challenge is these artificial barriers which are being created. So say, for example, if a German insurance company wants to invest into an Indian green energy company, it will be considered because India's rating is on the lower side. They will have to provision probably 100%. Why should that happen? So instead of giving us cash transfer of 100 billion, which my colleague was talking, we should actually look at do the credit enhancement. So do ASO rating transfer. So if I'm AA+, I can list my bond in European market. I can list it in the US market. So there are low-hanging fruit and easy solutions. Sometimes I find that at all these meetings, a lot of good fancy discussion happens, and the solution is in simplicity. And the simplicity should lie in the heart that world wants to become safe. We are seeing climate challenges every day, and now whether it's a climate harms are not happening by deciding whether it's a developing nation or developed nation. Flood can happen anywhere. So I think what world needs to look at is from more of humanity angle, that why are we making everything so commercial? Why can't we look at that like peace is essential, so is environment. And for that, whatever technology exists, let developed nation and developing nation create a pool of capital and buy it and open source it. So technology is no more a constraint. So you work from the mindset of abundance than the mindset of scarcity. So that's one thing which is required. And second thing which is required is the bringing down the cost of capital for greening the planet. I think the cost of capital is very high. When you go to the DFIs, and I'm a DFI baby, so I've always raised money from DFI. But when they talk to you at the dinner, they will say that the reason we are willing to write a check to you because your business is profitable, but we give cheaper money to the government, so we have to recover it from the private sector. So we are from the private sector operations team, we want higher IRR. So DFIs also actually talk, or multilateral banks talk very nicely at Global Forum on Energy Transition. But when it comes to the cost of capital for them also, internally the private sector operation is expected to give higher returns so that they can subsidize their loans, grants, and equity support to the public sector enterprise. And that's the real fact. The challenge is that the world doesn't consider private sector as a true party in solving this problem. So my view is that solutions are simple, provided we treat developed and developing nation in an equitable fashion, and we create environment equality. Because you can put trade barriers, you can put visa barriers, but air is going to travel. So whichever way the world is going to pollute, it's going to harm all of us, and we should look at a fair, equitable solution for the whole world.
Thanks, Vineet. So Thomas, we heard from Ash. We also heard from Vineet about the fact that while sometimes finance is available, it's not necessarily any cheaper, you know. And then there is this need for a lot of capital to be spent. There's a lead, which is different for developing countries as compared to developed. So again, I go back to the role that World Bank and other multilateral institutions can play to find the common ground that Rajiv mentioned about, to say that are there areas where we can agree and move ahead, even as we sort out areas that we disagree on.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I mean, he's right. You know, as I mentioned, this evolution roadmap, all of these points are being debated right now about, can we take maybe not a AAA rating? You know, could we break from the past and offer lower cost finance, because it's, you know, that's squarely in the crosshairs of these discussions. And, you know, we'll see how that all plays out. I think in the meantime, I'd like to pick up on the sort of green hydrogen discussion, because, and he was talking about sort of an open source model. And I think fully agree that I asked our global hydrogen team before this session just to give me a few facts. And I think there's about 500 projects right now trying to pull together the project financing package for hydrogen globally right now. They said it's about $250 billion. And all of them are going this at a separate way, trying to line up the project financing through, they want to get sort of an off-taker volume and price that works. They're trying to figure out, you mentioned the standards on what is green, and there's many different jurisdictions have different views. They're trying to learn technology, these technologies are out there and I think they're getting to be more cost effective, but they're still pricey and there's some risk around those. And then figuring out what locations have the sufficient renewable generation now and then the whole supply chain. And they're all doing this in isolation. So I think that one of the key messages that we're trying to put forward is, can we create a platform where we share and learn? We don't have the luxury to do this all separately and kind of keep to ourselves. We have to share some of the learnings from the technology, some of the business models, and importantly, the government policy frameworks. And so we did, just in this point, we have launched last fall, the Hydrogen for Development Partnership, which is designed to try to leverage our donor money. And we want to do some significant investments, including in India, to try to do some of these early projects. But it also will be providing, very importantly, some of this policy advice around creating the market and the standards. And hopefully it'll become a platform for this global exchange and discussion, so we can kind of open source some of this and lower the cost together rather than kind of doing it in pockets. So that's just one thing I wanted to offer on green hydrogen, because it's such a hot topic right now amongst many different countries. And I think it could be something that India in particular is going to take a lead on, given its experience with solar.
Yeah. So the other question, Thomas, is a point which I think Vineet made earlier, also about standardization of definitions, right? What is green hydrogen, or what is green steel, or what is green anything? How do you define it? Who decides it? Will different countries define it differently? And also have tariffs which are, factoring in this different definitions. So how is there a role World Bank or any other multilateral institution?
Absolutely. And that platform that will be part of that green hydrogen is just, let's have a discussion around the different reasons for different definitions, but hopefully over time it will come to, let's have consensus. And so then you kind of have, we don't have skin in the game in terms of making profit. We're just trying to get people to agree so you can see critical mass around a particular definition.
So as we're going to come to the end of the session soon, I'm going to quickly go around and ask each of you, what is the one thing which you think is most important for this topic, which is enhancing global cooperation and accelerating net zero transitions? Rajiv, start with you.
I'm sorry, I'll just have to repeat myself. Before talking of funding, can we share technological know-how on managing an increasingly greening rate?
Okay. Divya?
Yeah, I think technology, of course, and looking at some of the financial mechanisms that could be unlocked, that could be used across sectors, across countries, whether they are developing countries. North-South cooperation we've been talking about since long, but it has to actually, trickle down to some action that is taking place in terms of unlocking of some of these investments and climate financing. A lot of discussion has happened around these COPs, around some of these things, but I don't think we've really actually been succeeded in bringing in investments and climate finance to the developing countries, domestically as well as internationally. So that too is very important. Definitely what Rajiv said about technology transfer is important, but also looking at in-house technology interventions. There is a lot that is happening within India around technologies and mechanisms that are being created within the country itself to be recognizing those mechanisms and looking at scaling up some of these in-house knowledge that we have. And I think definitely because we work very closely with businesses, looking at how these ethos of businesses can be shared. Because unless we have those specific ethos around environmental protection, around climate action, around some of the things that Mr. Mittal talked about, abundance and cooperation, I don't think we can really achieve the bigger target that we are looking at.
Thanks, Divya. Ashish, one thing?
We haven't talked much about it, but it was a issue, whether it is on capital markets, what's green bond, what's not, on kind of various commodities, what's green steel, what's not green steel, all of this, there has to be a lot more discussion and acceptance of disparity across the South and North.
Thanks, Ashish. Vineet, one thing?
What I would love to see is that World Bank play a bigger role. And in a spring meeting, they come out with an announcement that they have convinced global governments, developed nations to buy 100 million tons ammonia. So 55 can come from Europe. And the purchase will be made from the developing nations and create a marketplace. See, what is needed is the solar and wind would have not come where it has come without huge government support. And now green fuels being global in nature, someone global needs to take that leadership. And there's no better organization equipped than World Bank. And since their annual meeting is coming, so it's the most appropriate ask from my perspective.
And the next chairman might be a made in India product.
So, Thomas, you heard Vineet has flattered you and also given you a target, right? So, any comments? The one thing that you think is most important?
I think it's a plane ticket for Vineet to come to the spring meetings. I think we really want to play that role, and I think you're going to see a lot of debate around this. But one thing I will just plug, you mentioned a concept that we haven't really talked too much about. We're also bullish on carbon markets, and I think that, in particular, I met with some of the government yesterday. You are moving forward with your own scheme, and there's a lot of uncertainty about what is the market demand outside in the voluntary market. How do you do this? And it's, is it greenwashing? I think we have now, again, developed a lot of really high-profile standards that we can apply to the carbon markets, and that can be a huge source of financing. I think, there's no time like the present to make that happen.
Thanks, Thomas. So I think we've had an interesting set of thoughts and ideas, and obviously the next question is what next, and what can we as CII and we as society as large do with these ideas and thoughts. Largely we spent a lot of time in this whole transition journey. We spent a lot of time agreeing that there is a problem. Then we spend a lot of time agreeing on the goals, right? But now we've reached really, the time and point in time where we really need to have a roadmap, which is obviously, like I said, going to be complex. It's going to be expensive. It's going to have inflationary pressures, a lot of standardization, a lot of definitions that need to be done. A lot of money needs to flow. There are challenges of the global South, which is about getting out of poverty, and at the same time trying to transition into a more sustainable society. And there are challenges that we need to deal with across the world, even in terms of defining how many of these things happen. So multilateral agencies, civil society organizations, corporates, governments, all need to work together for this. So I want to thank our panelists once again for their time and for their contribution, and thank you all for listening to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Narendran.